Welcome to the Fiber Optic Center's Jazz Podcast Series with your host, Dave Reis, one of the area's foremost authorities on the South Coast jazz scene from the post-World War II years to today. The South Coast Artists Index thanks the Fiber Optic Center for their continued support of the arts on the South Coast and underwriting this 10-part jazz podcast series. Your host, Dave Reis, will help preserve the memory and legacy of the jazz artists coming to and from the South Coast and how they helped to shape what jazz is today. And now, Dave Reis.
Hello, I'm Dave Reis, jazz host for the Jazz Podcast Series here at the South Coast Artists Index. And this is my fourth podcast, and my podcast about jazz, but basically it's jazz music, of course, but basically I like to give the information what the jazz musicians went through, what their careers had to do beside on the stage. And today we have a jazz poet, but he's not only a jazz poet. That's part of his thing. And we're going to have him talk to us about his career here. And let me tell you something about him, and then I'll try to let him do all the talking. Everett Hoagland. He was inducted into International Hall of Fame for Writers of African Descent, a Lifetime Achievement Award in 2009. When he retired from the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth in North Dartmouth, he received the Distinguished Service to University Award by the university, where he had created and sustained 5 different African American literature courses. And in addition to his poetry writing classes, he also won the Gwendolyn Brooks Award and 2 statewide property competitions for Massachusetts Artists Foundation Fellowships, as well as 2 Massachusetts Local Cultural Council grants for public book publications. His poems have been published in periodicals as diverse as the American Poetry Review, the Massachusetts Review, Essence, Gross Cultural Poetics, Drum Voices, Unity and Struggle, Politician Affairs, the Providence Journal, the Unitarian Universalist World, and his poetry has been anthologized in the Best American Poetry 2002, African American Literature, the Oxford Anthology of African American Poetry, Furious Flower, the Jazz Poetry of Anthology, Bum Rush, The Page, Afro-Asia, Stand Our Ground, Liberation Poetry. He has authored 4 chapbooks, and his most recent full-length was Ocean Voices, and we're going to do a little talk about Ocean Voices, I believe. Just Words, Here, New and Selected Poems. When I say most recent, this what I'm reading for was back in 2005. Hoagland has given poetry readings all over the USA, in Ghana, in Cuba, with a translator, and in China. He was the first poet laureate of New Bedford, Mass. from 1994 to 1998.
Good morning, Dave. It's good to be with
you.
Welcome. If I may, in an act of selfless, unembarrassed self-promotion, update that bio. That bio is over 10 years old.
Yes.
That since the publication of that book from which you read, I have been honored and blessed with the Langston Hughes Society Award. It's a national award. And the American Book Award,
yes,
which is for my book, The Ways, which is a collection of meditative poetry. And there are others, but we'll cut that short. Nice to be here.
Yes, that's why I'm glad to have you here to bring me up to date. You know, we knew each other from the university and everything, and then it's been a while. So
and from the community. And
yes, of course.
Our love of jazz.
Of course.
You know,
that's
but
what
you're the jazz encyclopedia, walking and talking.
Well, I don't know. But
yeah, you are. And I've learned a lot from you, especially about the local scene, the musicians that have risen and come out of New Bedford and this area. And I thank you for that. In our conversations over the years, I've acquired quite a bit of knowledge from you about, because you were literally raised into music.
Yes, yeah. They were my babysitters.
Yeah.
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 I was with them all the time, a little kid just sitting around. In fact, years later, I was talking to my Uncle Joe Livramento. He and Paul had moved to Boston, and then Paul Gonzalez in New York. And so when he got older, I'd go visit him and hang out with him in Rhode Island. And we'd talk, and I'd bring up different things. And he said, man, we didn't know you were paying attention. I was sitting in the car bored.
You were a child. You were a sponge.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good thing for us to remember. We know it as grandfathers.
Right.
You know,
Right.
that the kids will listen to what you're saying or overhear what you're saying. When they're teenagers or young adults, they'll repeat, and you say, "Oh my, you were paying attention. You were listening."
Yeah. That's what he said. So, when did you come to New Bedford?
I came to New Bedford in 1973. I was right out of Brown University grad school, where I got a terminal degree in creative writing, which was a terminal degree is one for which there is no more or further education. And so I was hired as an assistant professor at Southeastern Massachusetts University. And I started teaching full-time in the fall of 1973. And the students who graduated in 1977 were the first students in my 30-year career at UMass Dartmouth, which was SMU previously, to graduate. And when I was a young assistant professor, I became eventually associate professor and then full professor.
Good. Yeah. My first...
I was an educator for 40 years.
40
because
years.
I taught in Philadelphia and I taught in California, and I worked as an assistant director of admissions at my alma mater at Lincoln University, which graduated the first real jazz poet, Langston Hughes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I got a big kick out of that. I was reading about Gil Scott-Heron.
Yes.
Who went into class.
Who I knew.
Yes. And I'm reading his book, and the guys are saying in the dorm or something, said, here in Newport, Gil Scott-Heron, and one guy said, is he as good as Everett Hoagland? So that's how I knew you guys went to the same school from his book, yeah.
Oh, you read that? I think there's like a dedication that he dedicated to some one book to acknowledge the influence of some people. Well, when I was assistant director I had graduated from Lincoln University in June of '64. Incidentally, a couple of months, the April before that, I actually met Langston Hughes, who sat down with me and went over a couple of my manuscripts. And he was kind enough not to say anything about the cornier of the two poems, but he made some concrete suggestions about how to improve the other. And I wrote those suggestions on the back of the manuscript. And after talking with him, thanked him, shook his hand, and I left and went up to my dorm room, and I made those changes. And afterward, retyped the poem and entered it into the annual creative writing contest, the poetry writing contest, and it won.
Wow.
And so I graduated with that award. And then when the Langston Hughes Society, this was in 1964 that I graduated and met Langston Hughes. In 2015, I was contacted by the prestigious Langston Hughes Society, and they told me that they had their board had decided to award me the Langston Hughes Society Award for that year. And I was familiar with some of the writers who had won previously, so I was duly pleased and honored.
Yes, of course.
But that kind of came full circle from him taking the time to be with a little unknown student.
Yes.
Who's at the very beginning of his career as a poet, coming full circle, teaching his work and the work of African American literature for a career, among other things. full circle over the decades back to winning an award in his name that also had been given to some of the more famous writers in the United States in modern times. Yeah.
Very good.
So,
You know, I'm loving this because I'm going to do this podcast. I'm going to do as little speaking on my side as possible. You know, I have to ask questions, but I just want you to go on and just.
well, the fact of the matter is that when we meet for coffee, you talk as much as I do.
Exactly.
And our conversations are flowing.
Well,
if anything, we have to be careful because we take up so much time.
Yeah. Well, that's the reason why I say I want to do as little talking as possible, because we get into jazz and all that. We would go on forever, but I want to talk about Everett Hoagland and how you arrived to New Bedford, and also how you got into jazz.
Well, jazz was part of my raising too. I used to watch my mother and father dance jitterbug on the linoleum floor of our kitchen when I was a small child. My mother loved Ellington's music, and my father liked Cab Calloway's stomp music.
Yes.
But they would dance together, and it would bring me joy to see them act so lovingly and have fun. They were still relatively young then. They were in their late 20s when I was watching them do that, you know. And I asked my father once, whatever happened to all those records? He said, you used them like Frisbees and broke them. I said, what? He said, yeah. He said, you made me so mad.
Yeah, that's a funny story. That happened when I was a little kid, and the same thing, the 78s there. And my uncle used to pick up the LPs. Look, I can do this, and I break them, and he'd do it. So one day I did it, and I broke them. I was in big trouble.
You remember how brittle they were?
Yes.
You know? Yeah. And but at the same time, you know, my mother had Peter and the Wolf, which teaches children the instruments of the orchestra. Mm-hmm. And I nearly memorized that, you know. There's a sense of story there with this boy and the wolf and what have you. So I grew up, as many have, in music. And we had radio in Philadelphia. This is the 1940s. I'm in my 80s. Mm-hmm. And I was a war baby. I was born in 1942. Mm-hmm. And a year after Pearl Harbor in December of 42. And but I had no sense of the World War, of course. Too young and too little to understand that. But I remember listening to the radio, and the Peter and the Wolf collection that my mother had gotten for me, LPs, was narrated by Eleanor Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. And I had a very idyllic childhood in many respects. I was raised in an all African American immediate community that had been my grandparents, my father's parents' community. And with the barbershop that I went to was across the street, the bank was up the street, the grocery store was down the street, Market Street was 2 blocks over in Philadelphia. Everything, the candy store, I said, everything that I was interested in as a boy and as a child was my country, those 2 blocks, you know. Yeah. And the trolleys went by, and I was old enough that the ice was brought by the iceman in a horse-drawn wagon in our neighborhood in Philadelphia, and so was the milk delivered by a horse. And I loved the horses, you know. Yes. And I would marvel at the fact that the horse knew where to go. The driver didn't have to tell the horse anything. The horse, right, after a while, knew all the houses.
Yes.
But the hucksters, too, and the hucksters sang. And so there was all kinds of music coming from people's Victrolas, they used to call them, record players, and radios, and the singing of the women who would hum to themselves and sing to themselves and to one another, porch to porch outside, shucking peas and shucking corn, waiting for their husbands to come home and whatnot. You know, it's part of the culture. And then, of course, when you went to church and you had to behave because you were with your grandparents, there was a time in this country where there was a decorum that was taught by the community to children.
Mm-hmm.
And the last thing you wanted to do was to bring shame or be disreputable with regard to your family and your community. And I was raised in a community, as you were, where everybody knew everybody.
Right.
And you couldn't get in trouble. Because if you did, it got home before you did.
Definitely.
And you didn't want to go there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And one of the things that I find very distasteful and disturbing is the extent to which children in elementary school, and we call them junior high school, middle school, use profanity and vulgarity every other sentence.
I know.
In front of old people.
It's part of the language.
And use the N-word back and forth with one another, and also that was a fighting word when I grew up.
Yes.
And also F-bombs, like adjectives and adverbs, and what's left for when they get mad. Mm-hmm. They use that as a matter of common discourse. Yeah. There was a time when even the corner boys, the neighborhood gangsters, with do-rags on their heads, would punch one of their number in the chest if he slipped and used a swear word when an old person was walking by.
Yeah.
And these were tough guys,
Yeah.
And so for these children to be using that kind of language in front of old people is something that is extremely un-African American traditionally.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
Because if your parents heard that you said something out of turn to or around a neighbor, you got it.
Mm-hmm.
You got it from them, and you didn't do that again. But these kids are, unfortunately, I don't want to stereotype the entire generation of young people, but our language has uses. And there's a time and a place to vent anger and rage accordingly with diction that is coarse.
Right.
But to use it as a medium of verbal exchange in a relaxed atmosphere, as though among other things, it limits your ability to develop a vocabulary.
Right, exactly.
I didn't mean to get off of that, but because of somebody who teaches language, teaches literature, or taught literature for 40 years, it's particularly offensive.
Yeah, you mentioned the most significant part of my life. I was brought up by my grandparents. They're from Cape Verde Island, the old family. Mm-hmm. We stayed in that little block. And when I asked my grandfather, "Can I go someplace?" He said, "Yeah, you can go someplace. I raised you right. The place doesn't get you in trouble. You get in trouble." But this is what stuck with me till I grew up. He said, "If you get in trouble, you're embarrassing me." And that was it. And I would think about the guys who are going to do something. I said, "No, I love them so much in my mind."
Right.
I said, "No, I can't."
The last thing you wanted to do.
Right. So just words did it.
Right.
Yeah, it was a no. Yeah.
I'd like to read something from my book, The Music, which came out this past year, second edition. It's titled, the book is titled "The Music, New and Selected Poems," and it's about it's about jazz and poetry, and African American poets. I say in the introduction to the book, the music. When most of the African Americans from my generation use that term, they are referring to jazz. But the poems in this collection mention spirituals, blues, jazz, gospel, R&B, world music, hip-hop, even country and western. Otherwise, the poems in the book celebrate or eulogize jazz musicians and jazz poets, or make metaphorical suggestions about a connection between jazz performance and love relationships, as well as a suggestion about a symbolic relationship among jazz band performance and life and death. One poem in the collection ambitiously tries to combine most of these things and also tries to imitate the improvisational modality of jazz. I suspect that many of us who are African American poets would really prefer to be masterful musicians. Maybe that's why so many black poets have work that is so downright musical. Some, like Sun Ra, Gil Scott-Heron, have actually been musicians, songified lyrical poets. We've always had them. Considering all the blanching we have been subjected to, it is amazing how much ancient African culture and tradition is extant, much of it, like the music, creolized in African American culture. It is also amazing how many aspects of that culture have been and continue to be predominant expressions of American culture. Here are two short anecdotes about my disposition regarding where the music, as jazz, comes from and where it takes me. When Ken Burns' documentary series Jazz came out, a European-American music teacher told me, well, Burns spent too much time on Armstrong. I told him, that's a little like accusing someone doing a documentary on Christianity of spending too much time on Jesus.
That's right.
And a friend in my spiritual community once said, when the time comes, I'm willingly going into the light. I replied, when the time comes for me, I hope I have on my headphones because I want to go into the music.
Yes. I can't disagree with that. You know that. Yeah, but it's so true. Louis Armstrong was something. Modern music was originated by him, not just jazz. He's one of the first guys that was solo in a small group and do the singing that he did.
Right.
And then combos became in alt music.
Right.
Yeah.
I feel sorry for the people who only know Armstrong by virtue of Hello, Dolly and Sleepy Time Down South.
I do, too. You don't know how much. Oh, you just hit it.
Because the genius of his trumpet solos, he single-handedly developed what was going to be the modality for jazz performance for the rest of the 20th century.
Right. That's what I was saying.
And if you listen to some of the music, the solos that he did in the 30s, they're almost unbelievable.
Yes.
His sophisticated sense of rhythm, a little before and after the beat, and where he would take those high C's, that he practiced like crazy, and it's tortuous. He actually blew off part of a lip once in performance.
Yeah.
Because, as Stanley Crouch once said, you know, the trumpet is a common instrument, but it is extraordinarily difficult to learn how to play it very well.
Well, you develop your chops.
Yeah.
But Louis and...
Did you ever play an instrument?
I fooled around with a bass.
Yeah?
Yeah. But, he started scatting.
Yes,
scatting
that's right.
Started because he forgot the words, so he started scatting in the
sheet
song.
Music for the recording session fell on the floor.
Yes.
So he it's in the spirit of improvisation, in the best spirit, he started the doo-wop, you know.
Right.
And he did it so musically, it became a modality, an aspect of the music, a means of performance in and of itself.
Exactly.
And then some people took it to another dimension, like Ella Fitzgerald. And she became like the Shakespeare of scat.
Yes.
You know.
And their CDs together are amazing. And then if you listen to him, if you just, you listen to him singing, you listen to him singing, but if you're sitting down like I do and listen, and when he phrases his vocals, it's like coming out of an instrument.
Yes.
The phrasing, you hear this.
Yes. There's on the Ken Burns documentary, there is a lovely little segment where a famous trombone player from the early 20th century tells a story about, he was from the Deep South, like Armstrong, that he was on the banks of the river of the Mississippi at a function, and a riverboat came by nearly on the other side of the river, and he said he heard this trumpet music that was so sublime that he couldn't believe anybody living or anybody he knew, and he was a professional musician, could play that well on the trumpet. Found out later it was the young Louis Armstrong. Yeah.
They said in those days it was jam sessions. You come on your trumpet, I come on mine. We try to outblow each other, and he always had that handkerchief.
Right.
And one of the musicians from his time was saying, this guy would come up, he would blow just enough to outblow that guy. He wouldn't use everything. And the guy said the reason why he had that handkerchief is because he was hiding his fingers so they couldn't see what he was doing.
Right.
Yeah. He was.
I heard that one. That's right. They couldn't see his valve word.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And they said he didn't blow everything out that day, just enough to beat that guy.
Right.
He saved it for the next time.
But he was so extraordinary.
Yeah. And a lot of people thought he was just man. But he was very militant in his own way. I read where one time there was a black man going to college down the south, I remember it was state, and they were protesting around him, and he was the ambassador of the United Colony, ambassador of the state, and he called Eisenhower today. He said, I won't be the ambassador of the United States anymore if this guy doesn't get protected. And the next day, the National Guard was there.
Right.
So he was militant in his way.
He certainly was.
A lot of people thought he was.
A lot of people see him with the big eyes ogling, and his ready laughter and his grinning and that kind of. That was part of his stage persona.
Exactly.
It was a kind of charm that drew people to him and made them pay attention to the music. Otherwise, they may not have listened as intently.
Yeah.
But he did tell Eisenhower, unless there's some changes, because he went to Africa, he went to Ghana.
Yeah.
And he said he came back and found out what was happening to people protesting injustice, racist injustice in this country. And he was in solidarity with them in that regard and spoke up because he knew how prominent he was. There was James Baldwin said, James Baldwin was probably the best writer of fiction and nonfiction about the music. His short novel, Sonny's Blues, is a classic piece of American literature, and it sings, especially toward the end. I recommend that people read that, Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin. But Baldwin said about the perspective that mainstream Americans had toward African Americans. He said, it is only in his music because a protective sentimentality limits their understanding of it, in which the African American has been able to tell his story in a way that has been accepted. And that is an important statement because it says that a protective sentimentality limits their understanding of it, that the real sources from which the work songs and the spirituals and the blues and jazz came, they rose out of the anguish, the need to be celebratory, the spirituality, the very humanity of the people who created them.
Right.
They were forms of expression toward a better future somewhere, toward hope. They were testamentary. They attested to the experience of the presenter and also of the folk culture out of which the presenter came. And so you have the music is bearing witness. And by virtue of its attractiveness to other cultures, to people around the world, it spoke a universal language and communicated a state of being that was not communicated better by any other medium. And I mean, look, Bessie Smith saved the Columbia Recording Company. They were going under. They were in the red. Her first album sold over 100,000 records immediately, and they were in the black in more than one way. And the rest is history with Columbia. Look at all the jazz musicians and whatnot that they signed.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah.
But a lot of people don't know that. Yet, her life was a metaphor for the life of the musicians. People loved the music, but were very mean-spirited to the people from whom and the culture from which that came. Bessie Smith was buried. She made millions for a record company, and she was buried in an unmarked grave right outside of Philadelphia, my hometown. Within sight, the graveyard, the knoll of the graveyard, could be seen from my parents' bedroom window.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, it was Janice Joplin who put a tombstone on her grave.
Oh, no kidding.
Who located it and put a tombstone on her grave.
Yeah, there's so many jazz artists that you read up Lot of Seas, you
Right.
Blue Note and all that stuff.
It's like Billie Holiday. Sometimes they got, if they were addicts, they were paid with dope.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah, and some of the rhythm and blues groups like Clovers and all that. At that time, they gave them Cadillacs.
I give Armstrong
So they drive to a gig, 4 guys, each guy had a Cadillac, and they had no money. Ruth Brown, they did a job.
I was party to an interview that Stanley Crouch did out at the Claremont colleges in California. Went into Los Angeles, had gotten in touch with Armstrong's son. And not Armstrong's son, Ellington's son, and secured a time slot for an interview with Ellington. And I was in the room and party to and asked Ellington a question. Ellington was like a god to me. And I mean, he was, to me, the personification of the term jazzy. I mean, I saw him first perform at the Academy of Music in Philadelphia. He came out of the wings wearing a shark skin suit, gray. He had on rust-colored suede shoes, a maroon tie. He sat down at a white baby grand piano, and he was the personification of jazzy. You know, you wanted him to be an additional grandfather, you know. Yeah. So I was privileged with this interview in Los Angeles with him. And oh, goodness, I ran my mouth so much in terms of the introduction, I forgot why I brought it up. But it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. Wonderful experience, because in many ways, he would not agree to this, but by virtue of the titles of his songs and the source from which they came and the subject matter that those songs carried, he was the Langston Hughes of music.
Oh, definitely.
And Langston was the Ellington of poetry. Because they got so much inspiration from their people, from their culture. You know?
It's funny you mentioned those blues. That's a thing I remember when I was a young kid, and Paul Gonsalves. Paul was like an uncle to me. He wasn't related to us, but he was from Pawtucket. So when he was a teenager, he and my Uncle Joe, who lived from Bedford, who was my uncle, were good friends. So Cape Verdeans would do this. Paul wanted to come. He played Cape Verdean music and guitar with his father and brothers. But so as a teenager, his mother let him come live with my grandmother so he could play with the guys. So he wasn't really from New Bedford. Paul was from Pawtucket.
So you had an opportunity to interact with him.
Well, he was one of my babysitters. That's why, like I said, my grandfather bought a house, and he wanted all his family to live in the house. And at that time, most of the people, he got my uncles together when we lived in a tenement. So I was the first, in my generation, I was first nephew, first grandson. So they called me the baby brother. So when everybody went to work, Paul and Joe, they didn't work, they're musicians, so I traveled along with them. So that's why I absorbed all this. I was sitting with them. But anyway, so when Paul came, Duke came quite a few times to New Bedford. And whenever he came, I was a kid, the whole family would go. And I just sat on stage just looking at him. And he had those chuka boots, they call them, or something, the boots you were talking about. All I did was stare at those shoes, wish I could have a pair. And you bring it up, funny other things.
You've been listening to the South Coast Artists Index Jazz Podcast Series, graciously underwritten by the Fiber Optic Center, helping make the best cable assemblies in the world. Located in New Bedford, Massachusetts, the Fiber Optic Center also sponsored the jazz mural in the New Bedford Whaling National Historical Park. For more information, visit them at focenter.com. And now, back to the Fiber Optic Center's Jazz Podcast Series with your host, Dave Reis.
I remember now why I mentioned Ellington. Ellington treated Paul Gonsalves like a son.
He took good care of him.
So And he fathered a son when he was 19, and his son was born when he was 20. And for some strange reason, probably because I'm in my 80s and very forgetful, I can't remember his son's first name.
Mercer.
It's Mercer Ellington.
Mercer. Yeah, he was very close with Paul.
Yeah.
Mercer and Paul.
Yeah.
Well, Duke, of course, but Mercer and Paul were good buddies.
But Gonzalez was very much like a son also.
Yes, that's why.
To Ellington.
Yeah, that's why he and Mercer were like brothers.
Right.
Yeah.
But he would always say Gonzalez.
Oh, that makes me so. That aggravated me so much.
It was like Spanish instead of Portuguese.
A quick story on that why it aggravates me. When I was in the military, I was in a hospital in Okinawa, and then when I got out, Kennedy was saying we went there, so the war hadn't officially started, so they didn't know where to send. When I told them I came, they said, Sergeant said, "What are you trying to pull?" The next day, we're not there. So anyway, they called me Starboard of Okinawa because I was living with them. They didn't know where to send me. So anyway, the guys were real good. In the Army, they took me to Air Force Base because it was jazz, and I sat down, and these three guys, they brought me in and said, "You can sit down with these guys, and you can hang out with them. We'll come back and get you." So when I sat down, one of the guys says, "You're short." I said, "Short? When you're getting out of here, you're short. You're a short timer." So one guy said, "Man," the guy said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "Man, when I get out of here, the family my mother works for in Georgia, they have a summer home in Wareham, and I got to go there because they get these Portuguese girls, but they're not white." Here I am in Japan hearing this, and I haven't said two words to the guys yet, just hello. So anyway, another guy says, "Yeah, I know. I was stationed in Germany. The guy from Providence, he was one of those Portuguese." So anyway, they finished. I said, "Excuse me, can I? When you were in Wareham, did you go to New Bedford shopping? Because at that time there were no malls." He said, "You one of those Portuguese?" So I'm trying to explain to him what Cape Verdeans were.
Right.
So I said, "Horace Silva," and then I said, "Paul Gons."
Right.
"Oh no, he's Mexican. He's Mexican, Gonzalez." So since that time, now I get in an argument with a guy.
Yeah.
I'm trying to explain to him. So ever since then, I hated that word Gonzalez.
Gonzalez.
Yes. And Paul was not going to disagree with him. Yeah.
And it never contradicted to him.
Right. Yeah. So this guy was mad at me because he's telling him, "No, he's Mexican, Gonzalez."
I remembered why I brought up Ellington in the interview. I think Ellington was at the Coconut Grove, or that may have been the name. It's a big club in auditorium in Los Angeles. And I was at the Claremont Colleges teaching as an instructor at Scripps College and Pomona College, and I worked for the Black Studies Center of the Claremont Colleges, and so did Stanley Crouch at the time. And at this interview that he managed to get through Mercer with Duke Ellington, with Edward Kennedy Ellington, our hero, we were talking about the economics of the music, and we talk about unfairness. And Ellington quietly said that Elvis Presley made more money in one concert at the half shell, whatever the auditorium was in Los Angeles, as an individual, than his whole orchestra would make that year.
Yeah.
And that Ellington used a lot of his own profits to lease railroad cars.
Yeah.
So that, especially in the South, that his men didn't have to risk their lives trying to find a place to stay.
Exactly.
His band members.
He did.
And that they had the stability of something they could call home temporarily to come to sleep comfortably, to rest, to practice, that kind of thing.
Yeah, they were staying sometimes in funeral parlors. There was no wake. They put the musicians in funeral parlors, families' homes down south, and everything. But there's one success story, Ella Fitzgerald, Norman Granz, who brought respect to the jazz musicians with his jazz at Philip Morris, and he had found Oscar Peace and Ray Brown. All they made recorded company for them, and he had this jazz at Philip Morris, and he started in California for himself, and the theater was so successful they were going cross country, and promoters would ask him to do it. And then Decca record companies had Ella, and he asked them, "Why don't you have this woman sing some popular, Irving Berlin song, something like that?" "Oh no, we got enough. We got an amount of it." So they asked him to do a promo for one of his shows. He says, "I will, if you let me talk to her after her contract ran out." And then he did, and he got a contract in her, and he publicized it as an American singer. The song she sang, she became one of the best singers, period, not just jazz singers. But so that was a success story. But a lot of them didn't get away with it. With that, like Ella, he saved her, but a lot of the guys didn't save her. Like you said, they died penniless.
She was brilliant,
unbelievable
vocal artist.
Yeah.
But like many of us, including myself, she became diabetic and eventually lost her legs. And like B.B. Smith, who diabetic. That has taken a lot of musicians because it's taken a lot of African Americans.
Right.
Makes me wonder, because it's so relatively rare among Africans and so common among African Americans that it must have something to do with what was bottlenecked in the Middle Passage experience, that maybe the Africans who could survive on a diet of molasses and cornmeal had a physiological predisposition for a certain kind of metabolic response that allowed them to survive that, and that they passed on their genes. And of course, there's got to be a reason for it. I know a lot of it has to do with food, the kind of food that's eaten, and also heredity.
Yeah. Yes.
Because it runs in my family, But a lot of people don't know, a lot of the musicians and a lot of the poets are representatively diabetic. It's epidemic among African Americans or people of African descent, and that includes Cape Verdeans, Latinos, especially Puerto Ricans and people like that, and people of French extraction, working class, diet related. Because at one time, no matter how unhealthy the food was or how starchy it was, people worked it off because they were doing hard labor.
Exactly.
And people walked everywhere. Everybody, car was a luxury, and so walking was part of life. Commonly, even when I was a boy. I walked. The nearest high school and junior high school was 2 miles away. And I would either walk to school in the morning or walk home to save money for tokens. And then I'd do my chores, and then I'd ride my bicycle. Physical activity and physical work was part of life, and you learn that early along.
All right, about jazz, like I said, the word jazz covers a whole bunch. It's like food. So.
Yeah, Ellington said that the music called jazz is beyond category.
Yes, exactly. That's what I say. And so that's why I'm going to ask this question. What category of jazz did you like? I
like it's such a wide range. My love of jazz is consistent with Ellington's definition, with his characterization, rather, that it is a music that is such a wide umbrella that it covers nearly everything. Because the dance, the swing jazz, the swing music that my parents danced to.
That's what we started.
I love that.
Yeah, that's what we
but
started.
I also love bop. I love cool jazz, I love the new music. Some of the people in the new music, Ornette Coleman, David Murray, the World Saxophone Quartet in the 1970s, John Coltrane was, to me, a poet of jazz. And I loved his music. Most of the people in my generation love his music. But then there's exquisite beauty from the balladeers. I mean, what on earth in any museum or performed at any concert at any theater in the world is more beautiful than Dexter Gordon's solo, I'm a Fool to Love You.
Oh, his ballad playing was unbelievable.
It's exquisite.
Oh, man.
It's exquisite.
Yeah.
And I loved his performance as the jazz musician in Round Midnight, the film.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because of his stage skills and what he didn't need any teaching.
No.
He went to that naturally.
Exactly.
You know.
Yeah.
And what film school did Diana Ross go to play Billie Holiday?
Exactly.
She fell into it. Her voice, nothing like Billie Holiday's.
Yeah.
But she carried that role well
Yeah.
for somebody who was not a trained actress.
Yeah. The reason why I asked that because, in fact, a while back, South Coast Learning Network has a class of different places cooking, and they had me do jazz. And I call it Let's Talk Jazz. And I would play all the types because sometimes I know a lot of my friends, they learn about jazz during the Blue Note years. So for them, that's all jazz. You know, this isn't jazz. Oh, I don't like. So that's why I asked you that question.
Vanguard, Prestige, Columbia, all that. You know, you and I, over the years, amassed a huge library of LPs from all kinds of record companies.
Exactly.
Yusef Lateef. A lot of people don't know Yusef. His work, it'd be that album, Eastern Sounds. His take on an Eastern instrument on the love theme from the movie Spartacus is fantastic. It's just lovely.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite jazz tunes. My favorite version of Favorite Things by Coltrane is the one that was done in 1960, 61 with Atlantic. When McCoy Tyner's like 19 years old.
Yes, he was young.
From Philadelphia, incidentally.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
So many musicians came out of Philly.
That's right. We very proudly have so many great jazz musicians that came out of Philadelphia.
Philly, yeah.
If you listen carefully during McCoy's chords in Favorite Things, done in the fall, that was released by Atlantic in the fall of 1961, you can hear the trolley bells from West Philadelphia, where he and I live, ringing in his touch during the chords. And Jim Totley, the sculptor, friend of mine, who I brought to New Bedford. Jim and I didn't know it, but when we were little boys, up to the age of 6, we were raised in the same neighborhood about 4 blocks away from one another. And we met in California when I was teaching out there, and when he was teaching out there, and living in Los Angeles. I was living in Pomona, and I was living in Claremont. But it was played actually at his memorial service, mainly for the extended solos of McCoy Tyner, Favorite Things on Coltrane's album with a band of that, a cut with that title. And we both talked about, it sounds just like the trolley coming up the street on Vine Street in Philadelphia. And
so
McCoy Tyner is my favorite pianist.
Yeah, I saw him quite a bit. Right up until he passed away, I had been seeing him.
Yeah.
In fact, the last time I saw him, he had Michael Becker was on tenor with him in Boston, man.
I caught him down at the Village. The most recent time that I heard him play was in the 1980s.
Yeah.
Yeah, real early 80s.
Yeah.
It might have been 1980. But I love McCoy. Someday he sounded like he had 4 hands.
I know.
You know.
Yeah, I saw him at Jazz Workshop quite a bit with Coltrane a few times. But then after Coltrane died, the trio was still playing. They came to the workshop just without Coltrane, the band without Coltrane.
And then there's
Fred Taylor brought them here. Yeah.
Abstract jazz. That's what I call it. That can also be heavenly in its way. Coltrane's album Interstellar Space, the cut Jupiter, I think is one of the most phenomenal jazz solos that I've ever heard in my life. And if you listen to that, and then you go back to Ellington and Basie, and whatnot. Ellington's right. It is beyond category.
Exactly.
You know,
that's why.
But there's an expression that comes up in the past 30, 40 years that basically says everything about it. It's all good.
Yeah, that's right.
And one of the things it teaches us is inclusion.
Yeah.
You know, it is the music of inclusion in all ways.
Yes.
In all ways. Yeah. And it's about come on in, bring what you got, but make sure it's good. You know.
Yeah.
And if you got the chops. You know.
Well, that was the thing about jam session when I was a kid, or young, just going to jam. It was jam session. You had a trio, and guys would come in with their horns.
Play 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning.
Exactly. And then they'd come over, and you'd be so happy you see somebody coming in. Oh, look who's coming. Then another time you see somebody, oh, man, look who's coming.
Right.
But they all sat up there and played. They learned from each other. They learned on the job.
That's right.
From the big band days to that.
That was particularly true in New York. In Harlem, of the stride pianists, stride piano players, Willie the Lion Smith and the others, you know, and people could hear them because windows were open, playing this music. They're getting these free concerts, but then they're getting annoyed because people had to go to work in the morning, and this music would be coming out, and it would be endless, and it would be wonderful, you know.
And that's how some of those old piano players in New York got their jobs, because the clubs would have jam sessions. And the piano player would be playing. You'd be the piano player there. And I come in, I sat in, and I sounded good. You lost it. You know, there were no contracts and everything.
Right.
And then Count Basie, read Count Basie's book. I was surprised. Pick it up right on the page. First page, he says, my first professional gig was in Fall River, Massachusetts.
Get out of here.
So what happens, he was getting jobs in New York, but that way, they went, you know, he could lose it tomorrow for the next piano player.
Yeah.
But he got hired for a theater group, vaudeville-like type thing, and they used to have a ferry come from New York to Fall River. So they performed on the boat, and then when they landed, they performed in the theater in Fall River. So that was his first gig with a contract as a piano. Because it was a jam sessions. If you were playing 2 weeks, 3 weeks in the club, when I came, played better than you, that guy got the job, you left. So they had no contract. So they had no contractual job. They would just had job for whenever it lasted, whenever.
See, here again, you're teaching me. I never knew this.
Yeah.
Fall River has an interesting history. A. Philip Randolph was given to Sunset to get out of town because he was organizing the stewards on the steamship that went to New York and to other places from and to Fall River. And he was an organizer, and corporate America didn't like that, and they threatened his life.
Yeah. Wow.
But he was working out of Fall River, and one day they gave him to Sunset to get out of Fall River, or that they could not be responsible for his well-being.
Yeah. I remember.
They set goons up to beat him to death.
Yeah.
And he, of course, left and managed to help to organize the local from a distance and using local people to do the organizing. And I learned about that from Johnny Penna, the barber, who had been a steward on those boats.
Yeah.
You know how gentlemanly John was.
Oh, man.
You know.
He was.
And he ethnically was half Cape Verdean and half regular African American.
Right. Yeah. Well, you talk about the boats, and we go back, and they're going to kick us out. But
I have no sense of time.
Ella Fitzgerald's stepfather had to be a Cape Verdean man, because she, in the book, it says she knew what happened to her father left, and her mother married a Portuguese man. They were in Newport News, Virginia, who was a boatman like that, working on a boat, and. But in those days, before United States, Cape Verde got the independence, we were written down was Portuguese in the government. In fact, even when I was in the Army, they had me change it. I didn't put Portuguese. But anyway, and then she said, they moved to Port Chester, New York, and that's where Manny Costa and all the other Cape Verde. And the man's name was Joe DaCosta was the man's name. So her stepfather was, but unfortunately, he wasn't good to her, and she left. She was But
isn't that interesting? You know, Manny Costa was like my father in New Bedford.
Yeah.
Kind of adopted me.
Yeah.
He saw something early along.
Yeah.
And he there's a line in the film Platoon where Oliver Stone has one of the characters say, "A man has many fathers."
Mm-hmm.
And my father in poetry is Samuel Allen, who lived into his 90s and died.
Mm-hmm.
And my father in New Bedford was Manny Costa.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's my father, my blood father,
Yeah.
But that's very true. And there's my professorial father, Orrin Clayton Southern, who was a musical prodigy, who was the organist in the largest black Episcopal church in Cleveland at the age of 10.
Mm-hmm.
He was the choir master.
Uh-huh.
And he managed to get the education he needed. He could speak 4 or 5 languages. He had to learn Latin. He had to learn French. He had to learn German, and because he took the music seriously. And he became a professional organist. And but the American Organists Guild did not allow African Americans to join, no matter how talented they were at the time. He would have gotten record contracts like Virgil Fox and E. Power Biggs, but he was eventually, they had to let him in because he was the first African American organist to play nationally on NBC radio at a site of a pipe organ in a cathedral at the University of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And he was invited to play at the great organs all over the country and whatnot. But he was the head of the music department at Lincoln. And thousands of packs of cigarettes ago, I was actually in the Glee Club now,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty much Johnny One Note now.
Yeah.
I'm lucky to be here after smoking for 40 years.
Yeah.
I stopped in 2007.
Yeah. I was lucky. I never started.
They used to hook us, back in those days at college campuses. They'd give out free mini packs in the cafeteria.
They did that here too.
And nicotine is extremely addictive.
Yeah.
And it's probably killed more or nearly as many people from lung cancer as any of the other hard drugs.
Yeah. No, I thought I was going to be a great athlete. Well, I still play sports, but that's why I never tried smoking.
You were an excellent tennis player.
I started,
You were my brother's partner. I think.
I met your brother. That's
brother
all
John.
Your brother. Yes, yeah. In fact, I was assistant coach for the girls' high school tennis team this year. They asked me to help out.
Is that right?
Yeah, I'm very fortunate I can still do that.
See, you're endlessly
But that's why I didn't smoke, because and that's the reason why Joe and Paul, they wanted me to play. So they playing sax, and I'm a little kid. They gave me a clarinet. I said, I don't want that. But I wanted to play sports. That's why I never got it. That was everything on my mind. And it still is. I'm still
I took piano lessons for a minute, and then the guys in the neighborhood, the boys in the neighborhood, come to the back screen door. We had an upright piano in the kitchen. And they would come and stand at the screen door with a baseball bat, with the glove and whatnot, in the summertime.
Yeah.
And my family and my neighborhood nickname was Hoagie, like the sandwich, from which the submarine and the torpedo and the sandwiches come.
Mm-hmm.
But it was the Italian women in South Philadelphia working in the Navy Yard that Rosie the Riveters, they came up with the name Hoagie for a sandwich that had antipasta in a loaf of bread with olive oil and oregano on top.
Yeah.
But that was my nickname. But it had been my father's nickname before the sandwich because of the last name Hoagland.
Hoagland,
And my grandfather's name before my father was his nickname. So that name preceded the sandwich. At any rate, the guys would stand and say, Hoagie, come on. And I'd be practicing piano, and I got up from the piano and told my mother, I said, I don't want to do this anymore. And I went out. I regretted it all my life.
Yeah.
But if I had become musically capable, I probably would never have written a word of poetry.
There you go. Yeah.
And I'd like to end my conversation by sharing a poem, if I may.
Okay.
So can I do that now?
Sure. Whenever you. I want you to do the talk.
Well, we talked about Ellington.
I'm the host.
Talked about Ellington so much that I thought that you remember the films in the 1970s and 80s where Hollywood had George Burns sit in for the Almighty. He was God.
Yes.
And I thought it was very appropriate that a Jewish guy would play Jehovah, you know. And he did it with a deadpan humor and a charm that is quite memorable. Well, I've decided that if Hollywood could do that, then I could take an African American to stand in for God, and symbolically, and that person is Duke Ellington, who is a true creator in a secular sense. So the poem is actually prose and poetry. It's first and last parts are prose paragraphs, and the middle part is improvised, and it is poetry, and the title is Jazz Theology. The black poet Ted Jones, who lived much of his life, as did the musician who loved music and knew a lot about jazz, lived in Sweden and lived in France for a while. He said, jazz is my religion. In my way of thinking, if jazz is your religion, then, well, I'll get into that maybe afterward, but there's a whole sequence of things that should be put in place if that is the case. Jazz theology. And anybody who's familiar with and old enough to remember an Ellington performance will understand the symbolism of this. They had played everything from Sea Jam Blues to Come Sunday, but they were now playing their theme. And the aristocratic band leader and composer indicated with a nod that the time had come for the horn player to solo. The virtuoso slowly walked into the baby blue spotlight, took a spread-leg stance, closed his eyes, and blew, made new what he had heard in the music. Expressway squeals and tired tires and wheels whine, and always air brakes snort, just short of breaking rhythm with wheezing passing cars whizzing by, a chalky church immersed in immeasurelessly sound of organ or orgy audio, too tenderly intense beside the cat content prayer purrs and poured peals of bells over bees being busy buzzing, Sabbath sounds and frankly flowered trees softly swishing hushes overhead, unlike the beer bottles breaking and trash trucks making dawn treks to the dump and such with coughing transmissions and downshift and double clutch. The maestro cut him short. Why? His music moves in mysterious ways. The soloist lowered his axe from his mouth, opened his eyes, and acknowledged the applause with a slight bow before he quietly walked back to his seat on the risers. The maestro winked at him, tugged on his gold heart-shaped cufflinks, rose from the piano, which was shaped like the continent of Africa, and swirlingly dance-conducted the starry host seated on the risers. He gave a nod to his next soloist, then stood on stage just above us, snapped his fingers to his music's heartbeat swing dance rhythm, while telling us in all tongues he loves us madly.
You get a standing ovation from me.
Thank
you very much.
Thank
and
you.
This has been great, man.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
And
Incidentally, the book is entitled The Music.
Oh, yes.
It's published by Aquarius Press. You can Google Aquarius Press, and you can order the book accordingly from them. It's right there on their website. The other book that was done that won the American Book Award is titled The Ways, Poems of Affirmation, Remembrance, Reflection, and Wonder by myself, Everett Hoagland, and it's available from Amazon.
Thank you. As we know, I'm the jazz host, but this is jazz. You've improvised for us, you've created for us, and you are a jazz poet.
Thank you.
And like I said, the word
that.
jazz covers a lot.
Thank you.
And
always
you proved it.
Always good to be with you.
Yeah, same here. Thanks.
A lot of people don't know that you and I basically do this about once a month. We meet and talk over coffee, and I've always enjoyed it because I always walk away feeling better than when I started, and also because of what I've learned from you.
Well, I'll tell you another thing I always appreciated. I was 26 years at UMass. As long as almost every show at the end you called, two people I knew would call was you, and remember Tanya Bagas?
Yeah.
She would call, you're the best. So you two, right along till I stopped. Yeah. But, and other people too, but I mean, you two I knew for sure were going to call.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our beloved Bobby Green.
Yes.
Once forbade me to call anymore to the Music Biz Mystery Quiz, which used to give out free CDs to winners.
Yes.
Because he would do because he played sax among other things, he would play 4 or 5 saxophone players, and then he said, "Here's one, and this is a Music Biz Mystery Quiz. Who is the saxophone?" And I would call in, and it was Sam Rivers, and nobody else. Yeah. And he said, "Everett, you cannot call anymore. Other people deserve to win." Yeah. And I listened to his radio show religiously on Sunday. It took the place of church for me. Yes. You know? Yeah, I did too. And a lot of people don't know, those DJs like you and Cynthia and Bobby Green and Gloria Clark and went to that studio every Sunday, regardless of the weather. Mm. Yeah. And at a time that's usually family time for most people, the sacrifice involved in bringing the music to local people. I appreciated that no end. Yeah. It's one of the sophisticated things that was free and wonderful in New Bedford.
Well, you covered me on that. When Bobby first started, he wanted me on. My kids were really young, and it was Sundays. Later on, I did Wednesday night. But I said, Bobby, I'd like to do it, but Sundays I work, and Sundays for my kids. I couldn't do it. So then when he passed away, my kids were older, and Gloria Clark met my wife in the Shores. She asked for my phone number, and she called me. She said, Bobby wanted you. He says, now we really need you. Bobby's gone. So that's how I got on the radio from that call.
And the rest is history.
Yeah. And then I couldn't believe it was 26 years till I read it. When they closed the station, they had to write up. And
you did that for 26 years?
I couldn't believe it. I was doing Wednesday nights when they closed.
Over a quarter of a century.
I didn't even realize it.
Wow. Yeah. And what a contribution you've made.
Yeah. Well, that's the reason why I did it. It wasn't to play the music. And then I couldn't leave because I had a lot of callers that were shut-ins. They called me.
Right.
Thank you so very much. In fact, I had one woman, like I said, we could go on forever. I had one woman who used to call all the time, and she lived near the university. And she liked Joe Williams. So I was doing Wednesday nights then till 10. So I would play Joe Williams before I went off the air for sure. So then one day I called her and I told her that I got some Joe Williams CDs for you. I'll drop them off, but I'll drop them off on the way over.
What a voice.
At 10. Oh, yeah. So I come into the house after 10 at night. And she's on the phone. She said, no, I know him. He's David Reis. So she hung up. So I dropped the CDs off. So she passed away. This is a weird story. She passed away. Her daughter calls me on the station. She says, my mom passed away. She loved listening to your program. You're so good to her. We want you to do the readings and the mass for her funeral.
Oh, wow.
So I did. But then here's the funny part. After the funeral, we go to breakfast in the family, and they're sitting there.
Yeah.
And they came over to thank you. We wanted to thank you for so much, but we also want to know who this man was coming to our 90-year-old mother's house at 10 o'clock at night. Yeah. So there's a lot of good stories about the radio. I found out there's so many people that that's why I felt bad when they closed it. They don't get out.
I miss it terribly.
People, they don't get out of their house, and they look forward to that program.
It served a wonderful purpose.
Yeah, I didn't realize that when I was going on there.
And I called in and I miss everybody. I miss Cynthia.
Yeah.
I miss you on doing it because the anecdotes that you would share from your knowledge of the music were educational. And of course I miss Bobby. Bobby was my best friend on the faculty at the university.
Yeah.
And we actually traveled, along with his wife Flora, we traveled to Philadelphia together because we had relatives there. I had my parents there. He met my parents, and because he dropped me off at their house. And he had an aunt in West Philadelphia who lived like 3 or 4 houses from my aunt, my father's sister. And, they say it's a small world. The black world is a marble.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot, man.
All right, thank you. Let's go before they close the building.
Right.
We can go on further. Thank you. I appreciate it so much, the information.
Thank you.
Because we don't usually talk about, we just talk about the artists when we're sitting around. But
right.
What I heard today.
But this has been very much like that.
Yeah.
Comfortable, informal.
That's why I said it was jazz.
Right.
Thanks for listening to the Fiber Optic Center's Jazz Podcast Series with your host, Dave Reis. Please go to theartistindex.com for more information about the Fiber Optic Center, Dave Reis, or this 10-part jazz podcast series.